Welcome back, and we will be covering the last lesson for Unit 2, Lesson 2.5, the separate branches and powers. So in this unit, we are actually going to be focusing more in depth at those branches that we talked about in the Constitution, Articles 1 through 3, and basically some of the broad jobs that they have. There will be different videos for the actual branches specifically themselves, but this is a good way to end this unit before we move on to the next unit. So first off, the importance of the Constitution. Now, imagine it's already been ratified, Bill of Rights has been ratified, so you have this new Constitution. It's been passed. The Founding Fathers got what they wanted. They wanted to spread power to separate branches of the government, which they were able to do. They created a system of checks and balances, which many Enlightenment thinkers and Founding Fathers believed needed to be done. And you had the possibility of no more king or monarchy rising up from this new government. So there's no unilateral power. We use the word unilateral when one branch or person have complete power. So why were the colonists so willing to separate power? Well, exactly like we just said, they didn't want another king or queen to rule over them again. Yes, we have a president who is kind of the figurehead of our country, but they do not have all the power. They do not make the laws, and they do not try court cases. So we were able to spread power out in our Constitution, and that's what we call the separation of powers. We call that the separation of powers because each branch has a different power. Do they sometimes overlap? Yes, and we're going to go more into specifics later. But in general, each branch has a very separate job, and they're headed by different people in each department. So if you look back at our Enlightenment thinkers, you had John Locke and you had people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau who had that idea of we should have separate branches and we should have separate people running those branches, which is exactly what you get in our government. Does the president, make a lot of decisions? Absolutely, but they do not have unilateral power like a king or a queen would. It creates a government of constant conflict, if you think about it, where each branch kind of needs to be on board in order for something to get done. And that was brought up in Federalist Paper 51. Now, this is good because, you can't just have one branch make all the laws and not be checked, or you can't have the president decide to do something and, not be checked by the judicial branch. So it is good where you do have this system of checks and balances, but also you could argue this is also bad because you do need all three branches to be on board to get something done. Like we've seen from kind of 2018 to 2020 is we've had the House of Representatives, which is controlled by the Democrats, disagree a lot with the executive branch, which is controlled by the Republicans. And not necessarily nothing has been done, but it's been a lot more difficult to get things done when one of these branches opposes a different branch. When one is controlled by a different political party, it can be very hard to compromise. So it's good and bad. You can make the argument for either, but it does create a government that is in constant conflict and can check one another. And so let's go into more specifics of these powers that these branches have. Now in Article 1, remember that focuses on the legislative branch, the branch that makes the laws. When you think legislation, think laws. LL. That's what I always tell my students. LL. Legislative branch, laws. They make the laws, and like we learned from the necessary and proper clause, they can pretty much make any law they deem necessary and proper in protecting freedoms and protecting rights, and protecting property. They have the ability to do that. So this is one of those things that greatly increases our national government's power. They also have the power to declare war. I ask my students every year, when was the last war declared? Everybody thinks, the Iraq War or the war in Afghanistan or the Vietnam War. The last war that was actually declared was World War II. The last war we were in was over 80 years ago. And I know you're saying, well, we have the Korean War, we have the Vietnam War. Technically, Congress never declared war in any of those situations. So fun fact is that the last war the United States declared was World War II. So you can use that trivia to trick friends and teachers. Also, the Article 1 of the Constitution talks about the power to levy taxes and tariffs. So one of the big issues with the Articles was that the Articles of Confederation didn't allow the government to collect money. Now, I know you're saying, well, I hate taxes, but taxes are really essential in running a country and kind of funding these important programs and departments that we have. So anytime things like money come up, it usually starts with the legislative branch, specifically the House, but the legislative branch is really the branch that is in charge of funding our government and taxes and trade. So that is a very important power that was not in the Articles, but with this new Constitution is now a part of our government. So very important, these three specific powers the legislative branch has. Do they have more? Yes, and we will go more in depth when we cover the legislative branch, but in general, you need to know these three powers are the major ones the legislative branch has. Next, we have the executive branch. So this is the president, it's the vice president, and the cabinet. And when we're talking about cabinet, we're talking about the Department of Education, the Department of Health, the Homeland Security. So kind of all those departments fall under the president and the executive branch. And their job, it's very broad, is to carry out and enforce the laws. And what I mean by enforce is when a law is passed, somebody needs to make sure we follow it. Well, usually the people who follow it are, our police departments, the FBI, the DEA, the CIA, the ATF, Homeland Security, and that is enforcing these laws. Well, those departments are part of the executive branch. So the president is using these departments to enforce the laws that the legislative branch has passed. That is their main job. Now, they have many other jobs. One of them, which has happened recently with the Supreme Court, is the president appoints judges as well as cabinet members and ambassadors. Now, I have very importantly starred here, this is shared with the Senate. Every judge, every cabinet member needs to be approved by the Senate. So when Brett Kavanaugh, which was very controversial at the time, when he was trying to become the next Supreme Court justice, he actually had to be approved by the Senate. And if he wasn't, then he wouldn't have been on the Supreme Court. Now, the president can appoint them, but he can't approve them. President Trump couldn't have said, no, Brett Kavanaugh is our new Supreme Court justice. He can say, I want to appoint Brett Kavanaugh, but it has to be approved by the Senate. It eventually was, but it was very controversial at the time. So that is an instance where the president appoints, but it's checked by the legislative branch. Now, the president can pardon people as well. You may have seen this with Kanye West and Kim Kardashian going to the White House and pardoning people. And essentially what that means is the president can, with anybody, say, you know what? You are absolved of these crimes. You no longer have to serve your prison time, which is a big check on the judicial branch, because the judicial branch might put somebody in jail, but the president has this power to say, you know what? No, I pardon this person. They should be innocent or are innocent, or I think they're innocent, so they are going to be freed. Big check on the judicial branch right there. Now, the president has more powers as well. He creates treaties. So, for instance, let's say Trump wants to make a treaty with China. Well, he can make up that treaty. Usually the Secretary of State will be helping him. But again, this has to be approved by the Senate. So in two cases here, with appointing of judges and cabinet members and with treaties, The president can make things or appoint things, but the Senate must approve it. And if they don't approve it, then the president has to go back to the drawing board. So as you can see, we have checks and balances working in our government right here. And then lastly, this is the obvious one. They are the face of our country. They are the leader in times of crisis. So if there needs to be a situation where we need a leader to take charge, they are the face of our country. When we need somebody to represent us in, let's just say, the United Nations, they are the ones who should be representing us in those United Nations, or, those peace talks, whatever it is, they are the face of our country. And then lastly, we have the judicial branch. Now, the judicial branch, it is obviously the Supreme Court, but it also is other courts as well. The Supreme Court specifically is the court of last resort. Whatever the Supreme Court says, that's the law, or that's what has to happen. There is no court higher than Supreme Court. Although, fun fact again, there is a basketball court on top of the Supreme Court. So you could say that basketball court is actually the highest court in the land, but the Supreme Court and these justices are the ones who really make a lot of decisions that affect our entire nation. So let's just say with marriage equality, who can get married? They were the ones who decided these are the laws regarding marriage, and that everybody in our country, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, they have the freedom to get married to who they want to get married to. And that was decided by our Supreme Court. And then lastly, and probably the most important one, they interpret our Constitution, which basically means if the president or the legislative branch ever does something, passes something, tries to do something that the judicial branch thinks is going against our Constitution, they have the power of something called judicial review. So what they do is they review that action and they say, that's a good action, we approve, or that action goes against the Constitution, you cannot do that. Very, very big check on both the executive and legislative branch. We're going to cover Marbury versus Madison. This is really where this power came from, but that we'll cover in later units. However, you do need to know judicial review is one of those big powers and those big checks that this branch, these judges, have on the other two branches. The next unit we're going to go over is federalism. This is considered one of the harder topics to cover just because there's so many gray areas and so much to cover. So hopefully when you tune in, you enjoy those lessons, and thank you.